Hello everyone and welcome to this new class where we will continue reviewing the history of typography. In the previous class, we covered the entire section related to the history of writing, handwriting, and we ended right with the invention of the printing press, a key invention that was made in 1440 in Mainz, Germany by Johannes Gutenberg. As we already saw, this invention allows books to be printed on a massive scale as it reduces the costs and time needed to reproduce thousands of copies of the same book. In this way, knowledge can spread to all places and, of course, ideas go with the books. And how did this great invention work? We need to understand that this first printing press operated using what was called movable types. These movable types were basically like small pieces of lead, as we see in the image. Lead was the metal used since it could be easily molded and was not as expensive as others. And then here on the right, in this next image, we see a bit about the process through which movable type, that is the letters, were generated. For example, to generate this R, if we go step by step, first with a punch, the counterform of the R would be created. Not the form, but the counterform. That is, the blank spaces we find inside the letters. They would chisel that mold around the counterform to generate a punch with the same counterform. Then it would be turned around. We are now at 3A. To, through the hammer, imprint that counterform onto another mold. We are at 3B. We would again use the punch to chisel the form corresponding to the counterform around. Again, the same process. Once you have that punch with the R well defined, you turn it around and, using the hammer, create that impression in another mold. We are at 4B. From there, we would use a kind of framework where the lead would be poured to create the final mold, which would then be turned over so that, once placed on the press, we could print the letter in the correct position. Before moving forward, I would like to highlight that prior to the invention of the printing press, a system that could be somewhat similar was used. The etymological origin of the word perfectly tells us what xylography means. It is a word that comes from the Greek xylon, which means wood, and graphe, which means inscription. So basically, with xylography, inscriptions were made on wood. It is a technique that begins in China at the end of the 6th century. And as we said, it consisted of engraving different figures or letters, texts, illustrations on wood, whatever we wanted. Then it was covered with ink and pressed onto paper or fabric to generate the drawing of that relief. This technique allowed the publication of pamphlets, labels, and short-page works as we can imagine. But still, it was used to transmit all kinds of knowledge, from recreational to scientific or religious knowledge. During the Middle Ages, in Europe, it was a widely used technique. And continuing with the printing press, we have to keep in mind that we came from a tradition of handwritten writing. So those first movable types, those shapes of those letters, which we now call typography, were initially going to reproduce the handwriting that prevailed at that time. That is to say, the printing press will reproduce the forms already known at that time and place. As we have said, the printing press was invented in Germany in the center of Europe. And at that time, in the middle of the 15th century, the dominant writing style in Germany was Gothic calligraphy. Like the one we see in the image, therefore the first movable types were made with these shapes. Hence, the first book printed with Gutenberg's press was known as the 42-line Bible. This Bible is also known as the Mazarin Bible or the Gutenberg Bible, and it was called that because each page consisted of 42 lines. As we have said, it is the first book printed with Gutenberg's press and symbolizes the beginning of the print age. Here on the right, where we can see a double page of this 42-line Bible and how illustrations, annotations were still made on the printed pages in a kind of mixed form between calligraphy and the more industrial system that printing allows us. And precisely these books, which were born immediately after the invention of the printing press, are known as incunabula. Incunabula is a word that comes from Latin, meaning in the cradle. That is to say, they are the first books made with the printing press, so they still have that appearance of calligraphic writing. They are not far removed from their most recent past, and, as I was saying, on the same pages, once printed, illustrations and annotations could be made, giving the book still that artisanal look. Well, if we move forward, we will encounter a significant evolution in movable type, that is, in typography, which will transition from using that Gothic script inspiration to what we will call Roman. In this case, the inspiration will come from humanistic calligraphy. Another type of calligraphy which we saw in the previous class that arises from a new cultural movement like the Renaissance, and that of course will have a decisive influence on the use of the printing press. This movement, the Renaissance, develops mainly in what we know today as Italy, which at that time actually was not a single country, but was formed by different city-states such as Florence, Rome, Venice, Bologna, Mantua. The printing business quickly moved to this great center of cultural and artistic development. Specifically, it moved to a monastery near Rome in 1465, and here we can see how those movable types will transition from a Gothic inspiration to one based on humanist calligraphy. These typefaces we will call Roman, and it is at this moment that the figure of Nicholas Jenson emerges. We are around the year 1470, and now we move to another one of those city-states, in this case Venice, where Nicholas Jenson will create what is known as the first Roman serif typography. Here on the right we can see an example with a small text in Jenson's typography from back then, and right below the typeface that Adobe has designed, which we can easily download today, called Adobe Jenson Pro. As we can see, it is practically identical to the original. It should also be noted that Jenson in this typography introduces an innovation, which is the use of lowercase and uppercase within the same typeface family, so that we can use both proportionally and harmoniously. This concept of uppercase and lowercase, which is so recurrent and widely used today in the publishing world, can be said to have originated at this moment. And the very name of uppercase and lowercase comes from how the movable type was arranged. Let's say the uppercase letters were placed in the upper cases, in the boxes that are above. We see it in the figure. The upper cases have the uppercase letters, and the lower cases contain the lowercase letters. This was because lowercase letters were used more than uppercase ones, and therefore needed to be more accessible. Here we can see a text with that original Jenson typeface, designed around 1470, where, as we mentioned, the use of uppercase and lowercase in the same text is highlighted in a proportional and harmonious way. From that typography, the Jenson typeface, which has a significant, we could say, key importance in the development of other typefaces, different master craftsmen dedicated to the printing business began to make copies. We must keep in mind that we are around the end of the 15th century, and the people dedicated to the development of typefaces were not designers or artists as we know them today, but rather artisans belonging to different guilds. In this way, the typography that was trendy at a given time was replicated by different guild artisans. Here we see some examples. And we then come to another figure, the figure of Francesco Grifo, We are now in another city-state of what we know today as Italy, in this case Bologna, and we are already ending the 15th century. Francesco Grifo will be the person who will develop the typography that will go down in history with the name Bembo and has even reached our days. We can download it very easily from the internet. It is a typeface based on the Jensen, the one we just saw, and it will be called Bembo after the name of the writer, Pietro Bembo, author of the treatise called De Acne. In this treatise, this new typography will be used, and by a twist of fate, the name of the typography will not be that of the designer, let's call it that, but that of the writer, Pietro Bembo. And why is this typography important? Because Francesco Grifo introduces the concept of italics. Here we can see a double page from that book, the Treatise on Apnea. A double page written entirely in italics. The goal was basically to save space and economic resources, since italic typefaces are more condensed, occupying less space on the horizontal axis, so in the end, fewer pages had to be printed, making it cheaper. This type of typography was used at that time for short and simpler texts, given the characteristics I just explained to you. And here we encounter another concept that we need to handle, which is that of Venetian typefaces. We will refer to Venetian typefaces to all these types of humanist typefaces based on the Jensen, which are also called Aldines, since a printer, a person named Aldo Manuccio, was the one who made them proliferate. So basically, when we hear Venetian, Roman, or Aldine typefaces, we are referring to the same thing. These humanist typefaces that emerged in the second half of the 15th century in different city-states of Renaissance Italy. Here, on the right, we see a text using the Bembo typeface, which has been made by the foundry called Monotype. Moving forward in history, we enter the 16th century, and in the 16th century, a historically significant event will take place, which is the Lutheran Reformation. It occurs approximately around the year 1528, starting from the Council of Trent. And making a quick approximation of this historical event, we could say that the Roman Church splits in two, giving rise to what will be known as the Protestant Church. Martin Luther, a German monk and theologian, criticized the Church for the sale of indulgences as well as the sale of ecclesiastical positions and papal authority. Martin Luther would then write the list of propositions for an academic debate known as the 95 Theses, which initiated the Protestant Reformation. Focusing a bit more on what concerns us, this Lutheran Reformation resulted in the first translation of the Bible into German. The aim was to bring the Bible, a sacred book that very few people could possess, to, let's say, the common people. To create this work, typography is used as a design element and as a propaganda tool, as we can see in the image, and there is a return to the use of Gothic typefaces as a symbol of the break with the Roman Church. In any case, there were also figures in Germany that were more connected to the Renaissance movement. It is worth highlighting the figure of Albrecht Dürer, who is well known for his paintings, drawings, and engravings, as well as for his theoretical writings on art. Albrecht Dürer would also conduct essays and studies on typography. In the image on the right, we can see one of his anatomical analyses of different letters, where a geometrization based on proportions, geometry, and mathematical relationships was sought. Moving forward, in the 16th century, the printing business would move to Paris, where two very significant figures emerge, Robert Estienne and Simon Collins. These two figures will create their own printing house and will develop an idea where the typographies are going to mix different concepts. This new typographic concept is going to be commissioned to an engraver named Claude Garamond. The name Garamond probably sounds familiar to you because it is a typeface that has also reached our days and is very well known. Here we can see it in comparison with the Bembo that we had studied before. If you look closely, they are practically identical, except for how Garamond resolves the serifs, or the finishing strokes. The Bembo typeface has much more angular serifs, while Garamond resolves them with more curved and organic forms. The rest of the anatomical features of both typefaces are practically the same. But as we said, the Garamond typeface will be the first to include italics in the same family, and this typeface begins to be used as a second level of reading for notes and clarifications. In this way, the italic becomes integrated with the Roman in the basic architecture of the typeface family, but the italic will also maintain a marked calligraphic character and will be more condensed to save space in publications. Moving forward in the 16th century, we find ourselves around the year 1567, already in the second half, where we will highlight a final character named Christopher Plantin. This character will be relevant because he will be the first to start working in the business of typography, just as it is done today in a modern way. That is, before him, printers worked with a single typeface, but Christopher Plantin, in his workshop, began hiring different craftsmen to cast and create different typefaces that he would market, thus giving rise to the concept of the type foundry and the type specimen. This typographic specimen is, let's say, a catalog where all the virtues of a new typeface you want to sell are showcased. Then you are going to show, using graphic resources, all the variations that typeface has, whether uppercase, lowercase, italics, numerals, different glyphs, nowadays, bold, condensed, etc., etc. Develop then what we see in the image, which is none other than the first typographic specimen. We have therefore reached the end of our presentation, where in summary we have seen two major groups of typefaces: the Gothic typefaces, which led to the beginning of printing, and the so-called incunabula books. And we have also seen the Venetian typefaces. These Venetian typefaces can also be called Roman or Aldine typefaces, and they are heirs of the humanist calligraphy of the Renaissance. Within this type of typography, we have highlighted some that have reached us today, such as Jenson, Bembo, or Garamond. So we've reached the end of the class. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video where we will continue study the evolution of typography.